Rounding out the last of the Paladin combat tree, we have the three workhorse skills. 1, a starter tool that saves on mana cost, 2, an underestimated movement skill with some offensive abilities, and 3, a staple of countless melee Paladin builds. Those of you familiar with the Paladin tree probably know these as Sacrifice, Charge, and Zeal, each of which has been used in its own unique build as well. Starting with the one you can use from the very beginning of the game, we have Sacrifice, a skill that was improved to a point where I even made a build guide for it specifically, but it is still weird in its own ways in 2.4. The way it was improved is that the percent damage to self now decreases as you invest more in the ability, which means you'll usually end up being punished less for more potential damage, at least as you level it, and its synergies, redemption, and fanaticism of course. Though you do want to take into account the mechanics of the skill before you dive into it full bore. First up, and probably the most important, is how the damage return is handled. Simply put, the amount of damage you take is strictly based on the damage you do. For example, whacking a physical immune with Sacrifice will end up in you taking 0 damage since you dealt 0 damage. Whereas if you do 5,000 damage to a target and have a high level 1% Sacrifice, you'll take 50 damage, which isn't that bad. Now, it is also important to note that Sacrifice does not utilize any form of critical or deadly strike, and will not utilize damage boosters such as damage to demons or undead, so you're actually less likely to surprise yourself by doing an extraordinary amount of damage because of it. Now, the other aspect of this is the actual damage coming from it, which unfortunately cannot be mitigated since it bypasses damage reduction effects for better or worse. So for example, your Vampire's Gaze will not reduce the damage you take, but if you're amp damaged, you still won't take any extra damage from it either. Though of course, hitting an amp damage target will increase the damage you do and thus the damage you take, but that's a whole different matter. The last aspect is in regards to Sacrifice and Life Leech. Like many recovery effects, it follows the loss first, heal second principle, so you'll always take the damage from Sacrifice before you heal from things such as Life Leech or Life Tap, so you generally want to swap off if you find yourself in a panic zone of low life or fighting things you can't leech from, so you don't make it worse. But overall, for a mana-free damage boost, it is pretty solid, especially since it can pretty easily get into the 900% damage or even higher range with synergies. Now, moving down the list, we have Charge, probably one of the most underutilized but still exceptionally good movement skills in the game, mostly thanks to the popularity of caster paladins and Enigma though. That said, until you get expensive items, this can still be a great overall skill and can even free up the armor slot for resist or damage reduction later on. Now, the reason Charge is so good is that it greatly increases your movement speed value, though it is worth noting that it's based on the base speed values that are only affected by skills, not by gear. So the faster run walk boots won't speed it up, but vigor will. Though this also means you can be heavily slowed down by skills like Decrepify and Holy Freeze, though thankfully in Resurrected a lot of the buggy behavior with it has been counteracted, so you don't have to live in constant fear of the dreaded reverse charge. That said, you do need to remember while charging, your block is treated like running block, so it is capped at 25% and you'll likely get punched while darting through packs of enemies. Now, in terms of how it functions in proper use, you can intentionally target thin air, strictly to use it as a movement skill like Leap Attack, but without the ability to evade terrain obstacles. If you, however, want to use it as an actual attack, the skill does decent damage, especially with its synergies of Might and Vigor. It also does a knockback effect, which in this case works to its advantage since it can often allow sequential charges, though it is worth noting that charge is not affected by attack speed, so for chargers, you generally want bigger, slower weapons to maximize damage output. Now, if you cannot knock an enemy back, such as an Act Boss, Charge will not trigger if you are in melee range with an opponent, so you'll just be burning mana while doing extra basic normal attacks, without any of the charge attack rating or damage perks. Now, one thing to remember, and it's far more common in Legacy, is that if you get snagged by the movement bug with Charge, a weapon swap can be used to sometimes fix it. Though it is uncommon, it can be annoying to get stuck in place. Though I have yet to encounter it again since the release of 2.4, so I think they might have done some fixing on it in the back end. Last but not least is Zeal, pretty much the quintessential cornerstone skill of the majority of melee paladin builds. This is likely due to how the skill is both faster attacking and far simpler than the previous skills in this video, with the big unique aspect of the skill being that the series of attacks from Zeal are unable to be interrupted by blocking, casting, knockback, stun, etc. So you're able to hit quick, not worry about getting locked, and you're able to handle multiple enemies relatively easily. In terms of the actual attack pattern, Zeal follows the long recovery method of multi-attacks rather than the long windup. This means that the skill uses its fastest attacks right off the bat, with only the final attack taking the full attack animation. Though generally by the time you're doing 5 attacks with Zeal, this won't be something you really need to consider in any real detail. As far as synergies, the sacrifice synergy is usually better than even putting more points into the skill itself, for me at least, unless you're desperate for more attack rating, or you have not reached that 5 attack limit yet, which you reach really early on. Though generally most builds that use it don't even worry too much about the synergy, since they're often using other skills to supplement the attacks with elemental damage or chance to cast effects, though you can lean into physical with weapons like Grief sometimes. And with that, we've rounded up the Paladin combat skills. Next up, the offensive auras, which contain easily some of the strongest and most desirable skills in the game, so stay tuned for that. So do you have a favorite Paladin skill? Mention it down below, and I might use it for the cornerstone of a build video in the new format we have coming up. And as always, a special thanks to the patrons, channel members, and subscribers that help with the cost of running the channel, and if you want to help out, you can find links to them in the description down below.